Welcome back. We will start with lecture 2 now. Lecture 2 we are discussing morphology, acquisition of morphology by children, first language acquisition and how inflectional morphology is acquired by children through stages. Now, in the previous lecture we looked at we discussed about what is inflectional morphology, what are the different types, different kinds of grammatical features that the inflectional morphology reflects, as well as how they can be how languages may differ and how the structural properties might differ. Sometimes they might be in prefix, suffix, infix or whatever different kinds. And then now we are at the stages of development by children, and with respect to those stages we also have theories as to how how it happens, what kind of errors children make, why do they make those errors and so on. So, to start with the errors, when we try to understand how children learn their inflections, the first thing that comes to mind is the error that they make. There are various kinds of errors while they start when they start off in this journey, there are various kinds of errors. They have been called omissions and commissions. Omission basically refers to the dropping of inflection. So, in the words often the only bare words will be used, not with the inflections, and this happens more with the newly acquired words as opposed to the older previously learned words. So, the words that they are now familiarized with, now they know, so they tend to use the correct ones, but often when they learn a new word they do not use the inflectional marker. So, that is the case of omission in case of acquisition of inflections. And then comes the what is called commission, using regular inflections for irregular words, nouns and verbs. So, some of the languages of the world have irregular nouns, irregular words. So, English and Italian for example, they have irregular words, both nouns and verbs. So, which means that they do not take the regular the general pattern of inflection to mark various kinds of grammatical properties, be it tense, be it number, be it whatever different kinds of things might be reflected differently, but that is when they make mistakes because they use regular inflections with the irregular words. So, this is also the domain of what we call overgeneralization. Now, this is nothing new, it has been studied for a very long time. Rousseau in fact, in one of his texts he mentions that at first children have, so to speak, a grammar suited to their age, a grammar whose syntax contains rules more general than ours, and if one pays close attention to their language, one is amazed at how they follow certain analogies. So, this is basically what we are arriving at, the use of regular markers for irregular words. So, this goes back all the way to Rousseau. Burko took it forward with the famous walk test. Burko in 1958 carried out an experiment with children to see if they understand the meta-linguistic property of using the inflectional morphologies. But basically, do they know the rules? Have they figured it out? Have they figured out the rules? So, this was a very interesting study for the time. She showed children 5 to 7 years of age figures with certain kinds of figures that look like birds, and that she wanted to figure out if the inflections and their word they can be used on the nonsense words by the children. So, whether the children understand inflections, and if so whether they use it with the nouns words. So, the test was like this. Children were presented with small unfamiliar pictures of bird like creatures, and they were told. So, there was a picture shown, I have the picture in the second. So, this is a wog. So, they will be shown with a picture like this, and they were told this is a wog, and then there will be pictures of 2 of them followed by a picture of 2 of them, and then they will say now there are 2 of them, there are 2, and then the experimental will wait for the child to fill in the blanks. So, basically the child is supposed to is expected to say there are 2 wogs, that is what they were looking for, right. So, this is how it went. and then this was basically a test for morphological awareness in English. Results showed that 5 and 7-year-old children had productive knowledge of the relevant inflections in this case. So, 1 wog, 2 wogs. So, simple thing about, so they and now the wog is something that is not, that does not exist, but it kind of resembles a bird. So, they wanted to see if they understand this property as a general rule, and then they apply it to a new word, a novel word, which is actually not a word, but for them it is a novel thing, and whether they are able to apply the grammatical rule or not, and they found out that they do. So, the idea was, so the take home lesson from this experiment was, children must have abstracted the rule by this time. By the time they are 5 years old, 7 years old, they must have abstracted the basic principle that applies in case of number in English language. That was the idea. So, based on these various findings, we have different theories. We will look at nativist theory first, and then after this we will talk about the constructivist theory. Nativist theory, as we all know, this talks about the innateness hypothesis, that is language, the basic grammar, the universal grammar is innate in all of us. So, the understanding of the fundamental grammatical properties will help children to acquire the inflections as well, because they have the fundamental root grammar already in place. So, this will be helpful even in case of inflections. So, the innate grammar guides the child to know that language may use inflection to mark certain grammatical features. What they need to figure out is if their language marks that grammatical property or not. So, if their for example, if their language marks tense. So, in innate grammar will have the information that languages may use inflection, and the tense is a, let us say tense is a an important criteria to be marked. They have to simply figure out whether their language uses it or not, and then if it does, then how. So, once this knowledge is arrived at, children can generalize across words. So, once they have understood that yes, this language does use the property of tense marking through an inflection, then they will be able to generalize across all the words. However, there are errors that children make in inflection marking for quite some time. It is not that they get it immediately. For innateness hypothesis, the idea is that the children are born with the underlying grammar. So, there is they should not be making mistakes. So, in that case, the idea, because there are errors, then the idea that they figure out the whole thing immediately, it does not really work. So, here comes the idea of maturation. So, within the nativist approach, the idea of maturation is one important idea that has been proposed, and there are many approaches within the maturation theory, but we will look at one of them, which is called the agreement tense omission model, or in short ATOM. This is a model within the maturational hypothesis, which again is part of the innateness hypothesis. So, this model basically suggests that errors occur due to competition between two different constraints in the child's grammar. The grammar is already in place, that we must remember, because it is innate. So, but there are different constraints, two different constraints, and which are kind of opposing each other, and because of these two constraints, children make errors. So, the baseline is like this. So, in grammar is innate. If grammar is innate and children automatically have access to it, then they should not make mistake, but mistakes they do. And now, how do you answer for those mistakes? That there are constraints. What are the constraints? Let us see. Constraint number 1 is that tense and agreement inflections must be applied. So, this is the constraint number 1, that tense and agreement must be marked in the language, because these are important criteria. So, this constraint tells the child, basically guides the child, because it is already there, the innate grammar is already there. It guides the child to understand that he must apply inflections in sentences, specifically in case of, let us say, tense and agreement marker. Now, simultaneously there is another constraint, which is constraint number 2, which is the unique checking constraint, UCC. This prohibits the child from from checking items against more than one category. So, with it stops, basically this prohibits the child from checking those categories like the inflection marking. So, this results in the child obeying one constraint or the other, resulting in errors. So, because two constraints are working at the same time in the child's mind, sometimes the child obeys constraint number 1, sometimes they obey constraint number 2, resulting in kind of error. So, that is why sometimes they do not mark the inflections properly. So, if they are not marking, because sometimes they tend to use only the bare form. So, if they are using bare form, that means they are now obeying the constraint number 2. If they are using the morphemes correctly, then they are obeying rule number 1, constraint number 1. So, of course, every theory has some evidence in favor of it and some evidence not in favor. Let us look at the evidence in favor of it first. This theory explains why children tend to use bare forms and the infinitives in English and German. This is a very common feature in the initial stages of language acquisition among children. When they are beginning to use their small shorter sentences, they use bare form. Or sometimes infinitives, only infinitives. So, this is been reported in English, in German and so on. So, by this theory it is very easy to explain why it happens. So, the errors occur because they obey the UCC and thereby omitting the tense and the agreement marking. Therefore, they are sticking to the infinitives or the bare forms in the in the words. Secondly, this theory also explains why children may produce both correctly inflected words and errors, because when they are making errors, this is often reported in literature that when they make errors, this is not across the board. Sometimes they may use the inflections correctly, sometimes they may make errors. So, how can both happen at the same time? This is a serious question for the theorists to answer. So, it seems like this theory can answer that as well. So, correctly inflected form appear when the child obeys the apply tense and agreement rule, and errors occur when the same child obeys the do not apply constraint of the UCC. So, if they are obeying the wrong constraint given the scenario, then it is possible. If they are obeying the correct constraint given a scenario, they will get it correct. If they are obeying the wrong, so then they get the error. So, both of these, because both possibilities exist in this theory. So, both kinds of output are possible at the same time. Now, this happens before they have figured out the entire pattern of the language. Finally, this also explains the error of case marking. This is a slightly roundabout way of explaining, but they have explained it this way, that case markings are connected to the subject verb agreement. Now, if agreement marking is missing or agreement marking errors are still there in the child's developmental particular stage, then automatically case marking errors will also appear. So, this theory seems to kind of take into account the bigger problems of children using inflection in the very beginning, in the initial stages. However, there are some evidence that do not support as well. There are some problems, for example, there are some errors that this theory cannot explain. For example, subject verb agreement errors where wrong verb inflection in terms of the subject. So, they are using the inflection, it is not like they are not using. So, the theory talks about either using or not using, but they do not talk about the wrong use of the inflection. So, in case of the third person, it should not be the dog is barking, it should be dog, only dog, but in singular number. But in case of this, they are using, but if this is how they are using it, then it is this is an ungrammatical construction. This is also possible for children to use. So, they are using inflection, but they are using it in the wrong way with respect to the subject in this case. So, as per this theory, if agreement and tense are applied, they appear in correct form as per the universal grammar, underlying innate grammar. If they appear in the correct form. If they do not appear, that is because of the UCC. But if they appear, but in the wrong way, then this is not this theory does not really seem to have an answer. So, examples of such errors have been reported by many scholars. For example, in this 1998 study reports about errors from various languages of the world. Now, there are debates whether such errors occur before the child understands which morpheme to use. Because of the errors, because of the cross linguistic validation of this kind of a problem, this kind of an error happening, that they use inflections, but in the wrong way. Now, because of this data coming in, the person who proposed the atom theory has said that these errors probably happens because the child has not yet understood which morpheme. They understand that inflections have to be there, but they have not yet figured out which morpheme to use. So, that is one way of answering this problem. There others have talked about, is it prevalent? If it is prevalent even after they have started using the correct inflections in some cases. So, you need more different kinds of answers for that. So, one answer is of course this, that this is probably because they have not figured out, but the other cases, is it prevalent even after they have started using correct inflections in some cases. So, because this has been reported by Rubino and Pine. So, they report this finding from a particular child, 3-year-old child learning Brazilian Portuguese. For this child, the case was very interesting, because this child has understood inflections, is able to use the inflections correctly in most cases. So, overall agreement errors error rate was very low at 3%. However, in one particular case, that is of the plural verb inflections, the errors were very high at 28%. Now, this cannot be answered by the atom theory, because again as I said that either they have understood or they have not understood. So, they are either constraint 1 or constraint 2, but how can so if the error rate is only 3%, that means they have already figured out what morpheme goes where. But in only one particular case, that is of plural verb inflection, they are not able to get it all the correct all the time. So, 28% error is quite a high error rate. Also, sometimes infinitive errors do not follow the predicted pattern. As per atom, for example, correct or incorrect use of inflections do not depend on the verbs per se, as we just saw. So, inflections, if you get the inflections correct, you will get it correct everywhere. Similarly, certain verbs, if you have understood the verb inflections, it will be applicable for all verbs. It should not depend on the kind of verbs that you are using. Right. So, but then we do find evidence that the children do make mistakes with specific verbs and do not make mistakes with another set of specific verbs. So, there are reports of some verbs accruing more errors compared to some others. This is also evident. For example, in Russian, Dutch and French, errors are common in eventive verbs than static verbs. So, these are the two different categories of verbs. Children tend to make more mistakes in eventive verbs as opposed to static verbs. This also is a problematic case when we are discussing, when we are trying to understand inflectional morphology through atom theory. Then Wilson and Pine also reported that English children are likely to produce correct inflections in pronouns more compared to nouns. So, if it is about pronouns, they are more likely to use the proper form like he eats, she eats, they eat and so on, but in case of the noun, the dog eats, there are more mistakes. So, that is another domain. So, whether it is verb, whether it is different kinds of verbs or different kinds of nouns and pronouns, the error rate might differ. These are the situations that the theory cannot take into account. Similarly, cross linguistic variation as well. So, atom predicts an all or nothing sort of an approach to error. So, if the constraints are properly in place, then you will get it right, if they not, then you will not get it right, but it does not say that some languages will have more problems than other languages. So, that is also another domain. So, some languages may show more of errors, while some others might show less. Some examples have been given in literature. So, English and Swedish attract lot of errors, comparatively Dutch, French and German have moderate rate of errors, and then Spanish and Italian have very few errors. Now, this is another problem, that is, this is the cross linguistic variation, which again has issues with the theory. Then comes the nativistic theory of parameter setting. So, first was both are nativist theories. First one was atom theory. Now, we are talking about another theory which is that of parameter setting. Parameter setting comes from the principles and parameters of universal grammar. So, universal grammar has two important components, one is called principle, the other is called parameter. Principles, children are equipped with both. So, when you are equipped with your innate grammar, that means you are equipped with both principles and parameters. So, principle is basically the set of rules that are universal, that applies to every language. For example, you might have every language has nouns, every language has verbs, these will be the basic principles. Now, parameters will be those that are language specific properties, right. So, these are values that are set for language. So, let us say you can switch on and off certain things. For example, language X has classifiers, language Y does not have classifiers. So, for language Y the classifier parameter is switched off, let us say something of the sort. So, parameters are language specific, which is based on the child's input. So, kind of input that he or she gets, and then they set the underlying grammar to that parameter. That is the understanding of this is in a very brief, in a very watered down definition of principles and parameters. So, this is where we are going with respect to the parameter setting of inflectional morphology. Since languages differ in terms of inflections, some theorists have proposed that there might be something called an inflection parameter. So, the different kinds of parameters. So, one can be inflection parameters, because languages differ, because languages have various different kinds of structures with respect to how they will reflect them. So, there might be a different parameters. So, for example, Mandarin does not use inflection to mark tense, but English does. So, tense we consider this kind of a sort of an universal thing, but it is not. Mandarin does not mark tense in the with an inflection, but English does. So, English speakers set the parameter on the on mode. So, this understanding of tense and that aspect of the property of having this marked on the verb will be switched on in case of English, but in case of Chinese, that is in case of Mandarin, the Chinese speakers will switch it off. Thus, English children making errors can be explained as them setting this parameter to off position. So, if English children are making a mistake, because if you are taking the idea of inflection and putting it in the category of parameters, then there is a possibility that you can wrongly switch on or off one of the parameters. That is the idea here. So, if you consider inflections also as part of the parameters, then English speakers might by mistake they might switch it off, and thereby they can have errors with respect to tense marking. Now, why should that happen? This might happen because this is a position before they have gained adequate input in order to set the parameter within a language specific way. So, English speaking children will know after adequate input has been gained by them that this language requires the tense marking to be present in the verb. So, before they arrive at that conclusion, in the intermediate time they might switch off the inflection parameter. But there are of course problems with this theory, that this might not really work, that because children make errors in some cases and do not make errors in some other cases. So, it is not like if you have switched on the parameter, then you use this everywhere and you switch it off, then it will be nowhere. But then children do make mistakes in some cases and some cases they do not, as we have seen before as well. So, this is where the new theory comes in, new model comes in within the parameter setting group, in the parameter setting theory. This is called the variational learning model, proposed in 2002 and again in 7. So, this idea is that the children start with the principles as per under universal grammar, underlying in innate grammar. So, that is the principles, and the parameters are set on or off based on the language, but most importantly, which is the contribution of this model, is that each parameter is associated with a probability. Now, these are all parameters, principles are already set, there are parameters that are also there, but this parameter setting is based on what they call a probability. Probability changes adaptively, that is the most important part of this theory, that this probability changes adaptively in response to the linguistic data in the environment. So, when the child hears a language, she sets the parameter on, let us say, on. She hears a language and then she already has the parameters already there and in the universal grammar, in the innate grammar, and then she sets it on position and then tries to analyze the sentence with this grammar, the resultant grammar that will emerge out of the on setting. And then if this analysis is successful, if it matches, then this grammar will be used again next time. If the grammar fails to analyze the sentence, this will not be used the next time. This is how the variational theory, variational proposition is given. But then needless to say, this theory also has evidence, some support, but some in support, but also many against it. So, this is where we will complete this lecture. So, in this lecture we looked at the different kinds of errors that children make and how nativist theory primarily in two domains. We have talked about the atom theory and also of the variational parameter setting theory. So, both are within the nativist paradigm, within the nativist understanding of inflectional morphology and its acquisition by children. In atom theory, we have discussed about the data from both the supporting data as well as how the cases where the atom theory does not really analyze and does not really explain the problems, the errors that children make, and then we looked at the parameter setting theory as well. And in the next lecture, we will look at some of the data with respect to the supporting data for the parameter setting theory as well as some data that do not support. Thank you.